The girl's feet were bleeding when she screamed it. "The savage millionaire is beating my mom." And that single scream destroyed his empire. Rain poured over the quiet streets, falling hard against rooftops and running down the gutters like little rivers. A black car rushed past, its wheels splashing through puddles before screeching to a stop. The bright headlights cut through the dark, showing a small girl running barefoot through the storm. Her feet slapped against the wet road. Her knees were bleeding. Her thin white dress clung to her skin as she ran, shaking from fear and cold. Behind her, thunder rolled like an angry voice in the sky. But she didn't look back. She just kept running. Under a bridge nearby, a group of bikers sat beside their roaring motorcycles. They were big men, their jackets shining with water, their faces rough and tired. They were laughing and talking until they saw her, a little girl in the rain, eyes wide, tears mixing with the storm. Everything went quiet. The only sounds were the dripping rain and the steady hum of engines. The bikers looked at each other, unsure what to do. The girl stood in front of them, shaking, too frightened to speak. Behind her, in the distance, tall lights glowed from a mansion on the hill. Its walls were white marble, its windows dark like watching eyes. Inside that house lived a man everyone in town feared, a man so rich that people spoke his name in whispers. The little girl didn't know it, but that night she had started something that would change everything. She was only a janitor's daughter, but before the storm was over, her courage would make the world remember her name. If your heart's already racing, that means you're the kind who listens when others stay silent. Stick around. This story deserves ears like yours. And if you're brave enough to face the truth, hit subscribe now, before we go deeper. The nights in Brook Hollow were quiet but heavy, the kind of quiet that didn't bring peace, only the echo of work boots and the hum of streetlights. In one of the older buildings on the edge of town, a small light burned every night until dawn. Inside that light was Maria. Maria cleaned offices when everyone else had gone home. Her hands smelled of lemon polish and bleach, and her knees ached from bending, but she moved carefully, almost gracefully, as if cleaning wasn't a job but a promise. The promise was for Lila. Her daughter, only 10, stayed in the janitor's room at the end of the long marble hallway. It was small, with one chair, a metal table, and a flickering bulb that buzzed like a trapped fly. That broken light was her son. Beneath it, Lila spread her school books, writing neatly, whispering the words she read to keep herself awake. She never complained about the noise of the vacuum or the smell of wax. She was used to it. The scent of cleaning spray was the smell of her mother's love. Every night followed a rhythm they both knew by heart. Maria would start on the top floor, wiping the glass walls until they shone like still water. She would empty bins full of crumpled papers, dust the corners, and scrub the floors until her reflection looked back at her. Downstairs, Lila would draw little pictures in her notebook, flowers, stars, and sometimes, when she missed her mother too much, a woman in a blue uniform holding a mop like a queen's staff. When the building clock struck midnight, Maria always took a break. She would come quietly into the janitor's room, her shoes squeaking against the clean floor, carrying half a sandwich and 2 cups of hot cocoa in paper cups. The steam would fog the window as they sat together, shoulder to shoulder. It wasn't much, but it was their moment, mother and daughter against the long, sleeping city. Lila would smile at her mother's tired face, tracing the tiny lines near her eyes with her gaze. Maria's hair was tied back under a scarf, her uniform a little faded, her hands rough and cracked, but her eyes were soft. In those eyes, Lila saw everything safe and kind. After they ate, Maria would show her daughter old photographs. Most were bent and faded, but Lila loved them like treasure. One picture showed Maria as a young girl with big dreams, standing by a river with a school uniform too big for her. Another showed Maria holding baby Lila, taken before everything became hard. They laughed quietly at the way Lila's baby cheeks puffed out, or how Maria's hair refused to stay still in the wind. They didn't talk much during those breaks. They didn't need to. The silence between them was warm and full of understanding. Maria would rest her hand on Lila's head, her thumb gently brushing through her hair, and for that small time, the world outside didn't matter. The unpaid bills, the sleepless nights, the empty fridge. All that existed was love. But beyond those quiet hours, there was another world waiting. Maria's main job wasn't in that office building. That was only her first shift. Her second and hardest was at the Wallace estate. The Wallace estate stood far from town, where the air smelled of money and rain-polished stone. It wasn't a house, it was a fortress. Its tall iron gates opened to a driveway, longer than most streets, lined with trimmed hedges and white statues that never seemed to gather dust. The mansion itself rose like a palace from a dream, walls of pale marble, windows taller than people, and a roof that gleamed silver in the moonlight. Maria worked there 4 nights a week. To most people, it sounded like a blessing, working for the famous millionaire Blake Wallace, a man everyone called self-made. But Maria knew better. She had seen the truth behind those glass doors. She would arrive just before sunset, her uniform crisp, her eyes quiet. The guards would wave her through without looking at her face. The air inside the house always smelled of expensive candles and cold stone. Every step echoed, every surface shone. The staff spoke in low voices, always careful, always alert. They moved like ghosts, never crossing certain doors, never asking questions. The rules were simple. Do your work, make no noise, and never look Mr. Wallace in the eye unless he spoke to you first. Maria never broke those rules. She cleaned the long hallways lined with paintings of men in suits, each one with the same proud eyes. She dusted bookshelves filled with leather volumes no one ever opened. She polished tables so smooth that her reflection stared back at her. A woman small and tired, standing in a house built for giants. Sometimes she would hear Blake Wallace in his office. His voice carried through the walls like thunder, sharp and fast. She didn't always understand the words, but the tone was enough to freeze anyone's blood. His temper was as famous as his wealth. There were days when he shouted so loudly that the staff in the kitchen stopped breathing. Sometimes an object would crash, a glass, a vase, a chair, and silence would follow, the kind that told everyone to stay away. Maria had seen him up close only a few times. He was tall, with a face that looked calm in pictures but harsh in person. His eyes were gray and cold, his mouth thin, his hands always moving, pointing, snapping, commanding. Around cameras, he smiled like a movie star. When they were gone, his smile vanished like a trick light. She once cleaned his study after a meeting. Papers were scattered, a chair overturned, the smell of anger still hanging in the air. On the wall, one picture frame had fallen and cracked, his wedding photo. The glass was broken right across his wife's face. Maria worked faster that night, heart pounding. Some things were better not to notice. Back in the janitor's room, Lila would wait through those long hours. The mansion had a small storage room near the servants' quarters, where Maria had been allowed to let her rest. There was a narrow cot, a small window, and a faint hum of the generator nearby. Lila never complained. She kept her mother's old scarf wrapped around her shoulders and read stories from secondhand books until she fell asleep. Sometimes Maria would peek in and see her daughter's hair spread across the pillow, her small chest rising and falling. That sight gave her strength. It reminded her why she kept working, even when her hands shook or her eyes burned. But the more time Maria spent in that mansion, the more she understood what it truly was. A cage wrapped in gold. People outside saw Blake Wallace as a success story, a man who built his empire from nothing. Inside those walls, he ruled through fear. She had seen maids dismissed for breaking a cup, gardeners shouted at for missing a leaf, and one driver fired for arriving 3 minutes late. None of them ever came back. The rest of the staff learned to move silently, as if the floor might punish them too. When Maria cleaned Blake's office, she always noticed the same things. A glass of whiskey half finished, a phone blinking with missed calls, and papers marked in red. Sometimes there were bruises on his knuckles. She never asked why. Her nights at the estate stretched endlessly, broken only by short moments with Lila in that small back room. She would sneak in between tasks, bringing a slice of bread or a piece of fruit, brushing dust from her daughter's cheek, whispering comfort without words. Lila's eyes always glowed when she saw her. That glow made every hardship worth it. Outside, the estate glimmered with lights, but inside, shadows grew longer. The walls held secrets Maria didn't want to know. She had heard the muffled cries of Blake's wife, Elena, through the upper hallway once. She had seen her come downstairs the next morning wearing sunglasses indoors. her wrist wrapped in silk that didn't quite hide the purple marks beneath. The other staff looked away. Maria did too, because what could she do? In that house, sympathy was dangerous. Lila didn't know these things. To her, the mansion was just another place her mother worked. Big, clean, and full of fancy things. Sometimes she'd wake up and ask about the people who lived there. Maria would smile faintly and tell her to go back to sleep. There were truths too heavy for children. Every morning, when the sun finally touched the marble walls, Maria and Lila left before anyone else arrived. The road home felt longer after a night in the mansion. Their old bus rattled over bumps, carrying the smell of soap, dust, and fatigue. Lila would rest her head against her mother's arm, half asleep, while Maria watched the town roll past the window, the bakery, the old church, the corner store. Ordinary places, full of ordinary peace. In those moments, Maria sometimes imagined a life far away from the estate. A small house with sunlight, a garden where Lila could play, a kitchen that smelled of bread instead of bleach. But dreams were expensive, and time was cruel. So she kept cleaning. Week after week, month after month, her world repeated itself. The same tasks, the same rooms, the same faces of fear. She became invisible, a moving part of the mansion that no one truly saw. And that invisibility kept her safe, until the day it didn't. That night started like any other. The sky was heavy with clouds. The air smelled like rain. Maria arrived early because Blake had called for an inspection. The guards' faces looked tense. Something in the air felt wrong, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She found Lila in the storage room, reading a book about stars. Maria smiled softly and smoothed her hair. The lights flickered once, twice, and went still. Outside, thunder rolled. Inside, Blake Wallace's voice roared. Maria paused in the hallway, hearing the shouts from his study. Sharp, angry, like glass breaking in sound. She lowered her head and walked faster, pretending not to hear. But she did. Everyone did. The mansion always heard him. As the night stretched on, her cleaning rag grew heavier, her arms slower. She thought about Lila waiting in that small room, about the sandwich they would share during the break, about how she had promised herself this was only temporary, that one day she'd leave. But the mansion had a way of keeping people. By the time she finished her shift, the rain had started. The marble floors gleamed with reflection, and Maria's shoes left quiet prints as she passed the hall of portraits again. Each painted face seemed to watch her. She felt small under their gaze. In one of those portraits, Blake Wallace's great-grandfather stood beside a plaque that read, "Strength before sympathy." Maria stared at the words longer than usual. Strength before sympathy. Maybe that was how empires survived. She turned off the last light and headed back to her daughter. The small room was warm from the generator hum. Lila stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly. Maria sat beside her and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. For a moment, she allowed herself to rest. Just a mother beside her child, while the storm whispered outside. Upstairs, behind locked doors, Blake Wallace poured another glass of whiskey. The mansion groaned in the wind, its windows trembling faintly. His face reflected in the glass, calm, controlled, untouchable. But in his silence, danger lived. When the cameras were off, he wasn't a businessman. He was a storm, one that left bruises instead of profits. And Maria, too tired to sense it yet, was standing in its path. Some stories make us smile, and others remind us how fragile love can be. If you're still here, it's because you feel it too. Don't just feel, be part of the few who refuse to scroll past. Subscribe now so these stories never get buried again. For a long time, Lila believed the marks on her mother's arms were from work. Maria would say she slipped, or that the buckets were heavy, or that cleaning supplies burned her skin. Lila believed her because she wanted to. Her mother's smile always looked calm, and calm was easier to trust than the truth. But little by little, the truth started to show itself. It began with sounds. Lila heard them when she was half asleep in the storage room at the Wallace mansion. At first, it was just voices, low, angry voices that rose and fell like a storm behind closed doors. Then came the sound of breaking things, then silence. Silence that felt wrong, like the air was waiting for someone to breathe again. When Maria came to her afterward, her face looked pale, her hair a little messy. She moved slower, spoke softer, and kept her sleeves down. Lila noticed the difference. She noticed the way her mother avoided the light when they walked home, or how she covered her wrists when people looked. One morning, Maria pressed her scarf over her cheek and said she had hit a cabinet door. The next week, she wore sunglasses, though it was cloudy. At night, when she thought Lila was asleep, she would touch the bruise hidden under her sleeve and sigh. Maria still worked every shift. She never stopped. She couldn't. They needed the money, rent, food, school. Everything depended on those long nights at the mansion. She told herself to stay quiet, to do her job, to stay invisible. But silence began to eat at her, piece by piece. Inside the Wallace mansion, the rules grew stricter. Blake Wallace started to visit his staff more often. His voice was still smooth, but his eyes never smiled. People said he had become impatient, angry at the smallest mistake. Some said his marriage was falling apart. Others said his business was, but no one dared to ask. Then, without warning, he fired every male janitor on the property. One by one, they were called into his office and never came back. No explanations, no goodbyes, just gone. Maria stayed. The others whispered that Blake had said she was the only one he could trust, that she worked hard, never complained, and never spoke to anyone. Some said he liked that she kept her head down and never looked him in the eyes. Others said he liked her silence for another reason. Maria didn't want to think about what they meant. She only wanted to keep her job. Now she was the only janitor left in that giant mansion. Every hallway, every floor, every corner belonged to her mop and her fear. She worked while the cameras watched, their red lights blinking from the ceilings like unblinking eyes. She knew they recorded everything, but not everything they needed to. When she passed Blake's office, she could feel his presence even when the door was closed. Sometimes she caught his reflection in the glass, a tall man in a white shirt, sleeves rolled up, looking down at papers. Sometimes she saw him standing by the window, holding a drink, watching the rain. He looked peaceful then, but Maria knew better. She had seen peace turn into violence too many times. Each week became heavier. The bruises took longer to fade. She tried to hide them under layers of clothes, but even clothes couldn't hide pain forever. The other maids noticed, but no one said a word. They looked away when she passed. They had learned that helping someone in this house could cost them their jobs, or worse. At home, Lila began to see more. The broken glasses wrapped in napkins, the tiny drops of blood on the sleeve of her mother's uniform, the way Maria jumped at sudden noises. One night, as Maria undressed, Lila saw the deep purple mark on her shoulder. Maria turned quickly and covered it, but the image stayed in the child's mind like a scar. Lila started to wait up longer each night, afraid to sleep before her mother came home. She would sit by the small window, holding a blanket, staring at the street until she saw Maria's figure in the distance. Her mother always smiled when she came in, but the smile never reached her eyes anymore. The Wallace mansion grew colder with time. The staff shrank. People left quietly, their pay still owed. Those who remained worked faster, afraid to be seen standing still. The air inside the house felt heavy, filled with tension that never lifted. Maria tried to focus on her tasks. She scrubbed, dusted, polished. She kept her head down and prayed each night that Blake wouldn't notice her. But he always did. His footsteps echoed down the marble hallways, strong and slow. She could tell it was him from the rhythm of his walk. The moment she heard it, her heart started to race. There were days when he said nothing, days when he just walked past, and she felt relief wash over her. But there were also days when he stopped, when the air changed, when she felt his eyes linger. It was those moments she feared the most. Leela didn't understand power or money, but she understood fear. She could see it in her mother's face when she left for work, and in her silence when she came home. Lila began to help more around the house, washing dishes, folding laundry, anything to make her mother rest. But nothing could take away the tired look in Maria's eyes. Maria's body started to weaken. Cleaning an entire mansion alone was too much. Her back ached, her arms felt heavy, and her nights blurred together. Sometimes she forgot what day it was. Sometimes she caught herself talking softly to the empty halls, as if the silence could keep her company. But silence wasn't her friend anymore. It was her prison. The cameras in the mansion were supposed to be for safety, but they weren't there to protect people like her. They were there to watch her, to remind her she was never alone. Every time she bent to pick up trash or polish a surface, she could feel those red lights blinking, watching, waiting. Blake liked control. He liked knowing every corner of his house belonged to him, even the lives inside it. Maria began to realize that her silence didn't make her safe. It made her small. It made her invisible. And invisibility was dangerous in a place where cruelty hid behind charm. She started covering her face with makeup before work, using cheap powder and old foundation. It didn't help much. The bruises still showed through the cracks. She wore her sunglasses longer now, even in dim rooms. The other maids avoided eye contact. The guards didn't ask questions. Once, while wiping the mirrors in the main hallway, Maria looked up and saw herself. She almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her face looked older, thinner. The spark in her eyes was fading. She looked like someone else entirely, someone who used to dream. The sound of footsteps behind her made her freeze. She held her breath until they faded away. When she was sure the hall was empty, she picked up her bucket and kept working. Day by day, her fear became a habit. She learned how to move quietly, how to listen for danger, how to make herself smaller in large spaces. But fear, when kept too long, becomes something else. It becomes exhaustion, and exhaustion makes mistakes. One evening, Maria forgot to lock one of the supply closets. It was small and harmless, but Blake noticed. That night, his voice filled the mansion again. Doors slammed. The staff scattered like frightened birds. Maria stood in the corridor, her hands trembling, knowing her turn would come. When he finally left, the house fell silent again. The kind of silence that felt sharp, not calm. Maria returned to her cleaning, her heart pounding. She wanted to cry, but she didn't. She couldn't. Lila woke that night to the sound of distant shouting. She didn't move. She didn't call out. She simply waited until the noise stopped and the air went still again. The next morning, Maria told her they were fine. She smiled like always. But when she reached to tie her hair, Lila saw the red line along her wrist. That day, the child understood something her mother had tried to hide. The mansion wasn't just a place of work, it was a place of danger. Maria tried harder after that night. She worked faster, avoided eye contact, never left a trace of dust anywhere. But Blake's anger didn't need a reason. It came when it wanted, and when it did, it filled the halls like smoke. The cameras caught everything except what mattered most. They saw her mop the floors, polish the tables, clean the glass. But they never saw the quiet tears she wiped away when no one was looking. Every time she thought about leaving, fear stopped her. How would she pay rent? How would she feed Lila? Who would hire a woman with bruises she couldn't explain? So she stayed. She stayed when the other staff whispered warnings. She stayed when the security guard told her not to be in certain rooms after dark. She stayed because she believed silence could protect her. But silence has limits. It can hide pain for a while, but not forever. One night, the air in the mansion felt different. The usual hum of the generator seemed louder. The lights flickered as if nervous. Maria's hands shook as she worked, though she didn't know why. Outside, the rain began to fall again. Inside, she moved through the corridors like a shadow, the sound of her mop echoing in the distance. Every few minutes, she glanced up at the cameras. Their red dots blinked back at her. Lila was in the storage room as always, half asleep with a blanket around her shoulders. She had grown used to waiting, but that night something made her uneasy. She heard footsteps upstairs, fast, angry, uneven. Maria felt it too. The storm inside the mansion was rising again. She took a deep breath and tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting to her daughter. She imagined Lila's small face, her tired eyes, the way she whispered prayers before sleeping. That image gave Maria courage, but it also gave her fear, because courage and fear often live side by side. When the shouting started again, louder this time, Maria froze. The sound came from the study. A crash followed. Then another. The walls shook. She wanted to run to Layla, to hide with her until morning. But she didn't move. Her legs felt heavy, her heart louder than the storm outside. She stayed still, as if stillness could make her invisible. The noise stopped suddenly. Then came silence. A long, cold silence that told her something had broken beyond repair. Maria stood in the hallway, her breath shallow, the mop slipping from her fingers. The camera above her blinked once, twice, then stopped. And somewhere deep inside, Maria knew her silence had reached its end. The night that followed would not be like the others. The mansion was too quiet, the air too still. The world seemed to wait for something to happen, and when it did, everything would change. Most people would stop watching here, because pain is hard to face. But if you believe silence shouldn't win, prove it. Subscribe before you blink away this moment. Rain came early that night, rolling across the city in sheets. Thunder moved through the sky like an angry drum. Inside the Wallace mansion, every sound felt sharper. The creak of doors, the hum of lights, the faint buzz of cameras that never slept. Maria's shift had started quietly. She moved from room to room, wiping glass and picking up cups. The air smelled of old perfume and smoke. Upstairs, voices murmured, soft at first, then rising, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Blake Wallace had been drinking again. The smell of whiskey drifted through the halls like a warning. Maria tried to stay out of sight. She worked faster, hoping to finish before his temper found her. In one hand, she carried a silver tray with glasses. In the other, her old rag, already soaked from cleaning. The argument began over something small, a spilled drink on the table. A ring of whiskey had marked the edge of a document. Maria saw the stain too late. When Blake looked up, his eyes were cold and clear, like glass about to shatter. He said nothing at first, just stared at the mark as though it were a wound. Then came the sharp sound of a glass hitting the floor. The crash echoed down the hall, followed by a heavy silence. Maria bent to clean it, her hands shaking. But Blake moved faster. His voice broke the air like a slap, low, sharp, and dangerous. The anger in it was bigger than the mistake itself. The mansion's walls caught every sound, the scrape of his chair, the dull thud of footsteps, the first hit that sent Maria stumbling back against the wall. The tray in her hand clattered to the floor. Glass scattered across the tiles, shining under the light like broken stars. Rain slammed against the windows. The thunder outside rolled like a giant's roar, covering the smaller sounds. The gasps, the quick breaths, the soft cries that slipped through her lips. In the small room below the stairs, Lila woke to the noise. At first, she thought it was a storm, but storms didn't sound like that. They didn't have voices. They didn't make someone scream her mother's name. She crawled out from her blanket, her feet touching the cold marble floor. The lights flickered as she stepped into the hallway. The house looked different in the storm's light, longer, darker, alive. From upstairs came the crash of another chair. Leela ran halfway up the stairs, then stopped, pressing herself against the wall. Through the railing, she saw movement, a shadow thrown against the far wall of the corridor. Her mother's shadow, and another, taller one. The sound of the blow came next, dull and heavy, then a small cry that cut through the thunder. Lila's heart pounded so hard it hurt. She wanted to run to her mother, but her legs froze. She wanted to scream, but her voice stayed trapped in her throat. The next moment, she saw her mother fall. Maria hit the marble floor with a sound that Lila would remember for the rest of her life. She didn't move. Her head turned slightly to the side, her eyes open but unfocused. Blake stood over her, chest rising and falling, a glass still in his hand. For a second, the lightning from outside lit his face. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something else, something empty. He turned away, walking back toward his study as if nothing had happened. Lila stayed hidden under the staircase, tears streaming down her face. The storm grew louder, thunder covering her sobs. When the sound of Blake's footsteps faded, she crawled out. Her small hands touched the cold marble where her mother lay. The blood was thin, mixed with the reflection of the lightning. Maria's eyes moved slightly, then closed again. She was still breathing, but weakly. Lila didn't know what to do. Her heart screamed for help, but no one in that house would listen. The guards outside worked for Blake. The maids were gone. The cameras only watched. They didn't help, so she ran. She didn't stop to put on shoes or take her jacket. She just ran. The front doors loomed tall and heavy, but she pushed with everything she had. The rain hit her face the moment she stepped out. It was cold and wild, washing the blood from her knees as she ran through the driveway. Her feet slapped against the wet pavement. Behind her, the mansion's windows glowed faintly, like eyes watching her leave. The gates were half open from the storm. She squeezed through the gap. her dress catching on the metal edge and tearing slightly. But she didn't care. She kept running. Down the hill, the road stretched into darkness. Streetlights flickered one by one, their light bouncing off the puddles. Every breath burned her throat, but she didn't slow down. The world blurred around her. All she could think about was her mother lying on the floor, her face pale and still. The rain soaked her hair, her clothes, her skin. Her feet bled from small stones on the road. She didn't feel the pain, only the fear. In the distance, she saw lights, small, flickering, orange lights. The sound of engines came with them, a low hum that grew louder as she got closer. Under the bridge ahead, a group of bikers were fixing their motorcycles. The rain had driven most people home, but not them. Their bikes shone under the weak streetlight, their jackets wet and heavy. They didn't notice her at first. She was just a blur in the rain, a tiny figure running from the dark. Then they heard the sound, small footsteps splashing, a voice breaking through the storm. She reached them breathless, her face streaked with rain and tears. The words came out between gasps, broken and wild, but clear enough to stop every man there. The bikers froze. Tools dropped. The rain hit the metal louder now, echoing her voice back into the night. For a moment, no one moved. They looked at her, then at each other. The little girl was shaking, her hands pressed to her chest, her eyes full of terror and something else. Pleading. They didn't know her, but they knew the name she said. Blake Wallace. Everyone did. The millionaire who owned half the city, the man people feared to cross. But that night, standing under that bridge with the rain falling around them, something changed. The fear that kept everyone silent began to crack. One of the bikers, an older man with a scar on his cheek, looked toward the mansion on the hill. Its light still burned faintly through the rain. He clenched his fists, water dripping from his gloves. The engines growled to life, one after another. The men didn't speak. They didn't need to. They all understood. For years, people in that town had whispered about Blake Wallace's cruelty, but no one ever did anything. They were too afraid of his money, his lawyers, his power, until that moment. Until a little girl ran barefoot through the storm, her voice shaking as she told them what no one else dared to say. They didn't know what they would find when they reached the mansion. But they knew they couldn't ignore her. Not tonight. The motorcycles roared as they pulled out from under the bridge, their headlights cutting through the rain. The noise was loud enough to shake the street, a sound that carried courage in it. Lila stood there for a moment, watching them ride off toward the hill. Her tears mixed with the rain. She didn't know what would happen next. She only knew that, for the first time since the storm began, she wasn't alone anymore. Back at the mansion, the lights flickered again. The air was heavy with silence. Inside, Maria lay on the cold floor, the sound of thunder rolling above her like a warning. But something new was coming. Something louder than fear, stronger than silence. The sound of engines grew closer, and for the first time in years, someone was coming for Blake Wallace. She ran barefoot to save the only person she loved. And you're still here, safe behind a screen. If that makes your chest tighten, you already know what to do. Subscribe and let the world know you still care. The sound of engines filled the night like thunder rolling on the ground. Under the old bridge, rain fell through cracks in the concrete, tapping on leather jackets, dripping from helmets and metal pipes. The smell of wet oil mixed with smoke. 10 men stood in the half-dark, their bikes lined up like soldiers waiting for orders. They weren't heroes. They were mechanics, truck drivers, men who'd seen too much of the world to believe in justice. Some of them had families, some didn't. All of them knew the name Blake Wallace. Everyone in Brook Hollow did. He was the man who built half the city, the man whose company name sat on schools, hospitals, and banks, the man who bought silence with checks and fear. The bikers had fixed his cars before, the expensive ones, engines so clean you could eat off them. He paid well, but he paid coldly. They remembered his eyes. They remembered the guards standing nearby, the cameras watching. None of them liked him, but they respected the danger around him. No one crossed Blake Wallace, not the mayor, not the police, not the people who worked for him. He was untouchable. But that night under the bridge, something changed. The rain came harder, filling puddles around their boots. The little girl sat on the ground, soaked and shaking, her face pale under the streetlight. One of the bikers gave her his jacket. Another tried to find a dry rag for her hands. None of them knew what to do with her tears. They were men used to noise, not crying. The world above the bridge kept moving, cars passing, lights glowing, but beneath it, time slowed. The storm seemed to pause to listen. They looked at one another, waiting for someone to speak, but no words came. Everyone was thinking the same thing. If they went up that hill, if they stepped into Blake Wallace's world, there would be no going back. Some of them had debts to him. A few had signed papers that tied them to his company. Others had family working in his buildings. To fight him was to risk everything. Jobs, homes, freedom. Yet the image of that small girl crying in the rain burned in their minds. Her thin arms, her bleeding feet, her voice cracking when she said the words, "He's beating my mom." There was a kind of silence that carried more weight than sound. The men stood in it now, shoulders tense, eyes avoiding one another. A younger man, barely 30, kicked at a puddle. He was angry, not at her, not even at Blake, but at the world that made this normal. Another older man, gray beard wet with rain, looked at the ground as if searching for the right choice in the mud. They didn't need to say what they all knew. If they left her here, they'd never forget it. The rain wasn't just water anymore. It felt like guilt. Each drop carried the memory of her words. A few of them started their bikes again, not to leave, but to drown out the thoughts screaming in their heads. The engines growled and echoed off the bridge walls. It didn't help. Some tried to reason quietly with themselves. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe the mother would be fine. Maybe someone else would help. But every excuse died the same way, with the sound of that child's sobs. They were men who had lived through enough nights to know that silence could kill. Once, years ago, one of them had seen something similar. A neighbor hurt by her husband, the whole street pretending not to hear. She died 2 weeks later. That memory came back now, sharp and heavy. He looked up at the mansion's hill, and his jaw tightened. Another man had lost a sister in a fight she never escaped. He'd been too late then. The guilt had never left him. It sat in his chest every night when he tried to sleep. Tonight, that same guilt rose again, older and louder. They didn't talk about it, but the storm did. The thunder filled the spaces where words should have been. What's the price of silence when someone's dying on the other side of the wall? The question hung between them, unspoken but alive. It was heavier than the rain, heavier than the fear. In the far corner of the bridge, the oldest among them, a man named Dale, stared toward the mansion's glowing outline. He had worked in Blake's garage years ago, seen the temper that lived behind the businessman's smile. He had watched a man get fired for dropping a wrench, watched him lose his house 2 months later. Dale had kept quiet then. It had haunted him since. He looked at the girl again. She was still sitting there, clutching his jacket around her small frame. Her eyes weren't crying anymore. They just stared empty, as if she had already seen too much for her age. Something broke inside him, not loud, not visible, but real. And he reached for his helmet, brushed off the rain, and set it on his head. The sound of the buckle snapping shut was small but final. Another man noticed and did the same. Then another. No one gave orders. No one spoke. The decision spread like fire through the group, quiet but unstoppable. Engines began to growl again, deeper this time. Headlights flickered to life, one by one, cutting through the falling rain. The bridge lit up with white light and echoing thunder. The girl looked up, startled as the men mounted their bikes. The wind from the engines pushed her hair back. They didn't leave her behind. 2 men stayed, one to guard her, one to call an ambulance just in case. The rest turned toward the road that climbed to the mansion. They all knew what they were risking. Blake Wallace's reach was long. His guards carried weapons. His lawyers could twist truth into nothing. But there are moments when fear stops mattering. This was one of them. For years, they had all told themselves the same lie. That nothing could be changed. That power always wins. But power was built on the belief that no one would fight back. And tonight, 10 men decided that belief was wrong. They revved their engines. The sound was low at first, then louder, until it drowned out the rain itself. The air shook. The bridge trembled. The little girl covered her ears. The bikers pulled out one after another, tires slicing through the wet road. The lights from their bikes formed a moving line through the night. like a trail of fire heading toward the storm. The wind tore at their jackets. The rain hit like needles against their faces. But they didn't slow down. The mansion rose ahead, its white walls bright under the lightning. Behind them, the bridge grew quiet again. The storm went on, but something in the air had changed. The night no longer belonged to fear. Back inside the mansion, Maria lay still on the floor. The lights flickered as the power strained under the thunder. Somewhere above, Blake walked back and forth, the sound of his shoes sharp against the marble. He didn't know yet what was coming for him. The first roar of motorcycles reached the bottom of the hill, echoing through the valley. The guards at the gate heard it too. They looked at each other, confused. No one came up this road at night, especially not in a storm. The engines grew louder, closer. The men at the gate stepped forward, flashlights trembling in their hands. Then the headlights appeared through the rain, 10 beams cutting through the dark like knives. Inside the bridge, the two bikers left behind watched from afar. They didn't know what would happen next. None of them did. But for the first time in a long while, they felt something clean. Not hope exactly, but something close. The feeling of doing what was right, no matter the cost. The girl was quiet now. She watched the road too, eyes wide, lips parted. The sound of engines fading into the storm was the sound of her mother's chance. Maybe small, maybe late, but real. The rain washed the oil off the street. The thunder rolled away, softer now, as if the storm itself was waiting to see what these men would do. 10 engines, one promise. To end the silence that had lived too long. To fight the kind of fear that kept people small. To make sure one woman's pain would not be ignored again. They didn't ride for glory or fame or justice written in books. They rode because a child had cried, and the sound of that cry had found the last bits of good left in their hearts. The road bent upward. The mansion lights grew bigger. The sound of engines rose like war drums. And as the night opened wide, the storm gave way to something else. Not peace, not yet, but courage. The kind that changes everything. Most people stay quiet when it isn't their fight. But you're not most people. You made it this far. Hit subscribe and join those who'd rather act than look away. The road to the Wallace mansion wound up the hill like a black ribbon, slick with rain and oil. The bikers' headlights glowed against the storm, cutting through sheets of water as thunder rolled above them. The mansion's white walls stood ahead, bright and distant, like something holy and untouchable. But the men riding toward it knew better. They didn't come to fight. They came to save. The engines roared as they climbed the hill. Mud splashed, wind tore at their jackets, and lightning flashed across the sky, showing their faces, set, cold, and determined. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. At the gate, the guards stepped forward, flashlights waving through the storm. They shouted something, but the thunder swallowed the words. Then the motorcycles hit the gates. Metal screamed as hinges gave way. The gates burst open under the force, swinging wide like the jaws of a beast. Headlights flooded the long driveway. Tires slid over marble stone. The rain turned the ground to glass, reflecting every beam of light. The mansion's windows glowed faintly. Behind one of them, a tall figure moved, a shadow pacing back and forth. The bikers spread out as they reached the main entrance. The doors stood half open, swaying in the wind. They could feel it immediately. The wrongness in the air. The kind that doesn't need proof to be understood. The house was too quiet. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, smelling of whiskey, blood, and storm water. A broken glass lay near the stairs. The marble floor was smeared with something darker than rain. They found her near the foot of the stairs. Maria. Her uniform was torn, her face pale. One arm bent awkwardly against the floor. Her eyes were half open, unfocused, staring at nothing. Rain from the open door crept toward her like a thin silver path. For a second, the men stood frozen. The storm seemed to stop outside. No one breathed. Then one of them moved. He bent down beside her, fingers trembling as he checked her pulse. His face said everything before his voice could. She was gone. The world seemed to tilt. The sound of thunder returned, louder, as if mocking them for being too late. They had come to save her. They had come with noise and courage and fire. But courage was late that night, and fire came only after loss. From the upper hallway, footsteps echoed. slow, steady, unhurried. Blake Wallace appeared at the top of the stairs. His white shirt was open at the collar. His hands were stained red. In one hand he still held a half-empty glass. He looked down at them, calm as ever, like a man who had finished a chore. His eyes were cold. His mouth twitched, almost like a smile. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His face said what his words would have denied. He believed himself untouchable. The men at the bottom of the stairs didn't move either. Their anger was a quiet kind, the kind that didn't shout, the kind that burned. Police sirens began to wail in the distance. The sound grew closer, blue lights flashing faintly through the rain. When the police arrived, they didn't come for Blake Wallace. They came for the noise. They came for the bikers. The officers moved fast, shouting orders, pushing the men back. They surrounded the mansion, took photos, asked questions that didn't matter. Blake stood beside them, speaking softly, pointing to the bruises on his arm, the scratch near his cheek. His voice was calm, controlled, practiced. He told them it was self-defense. He told them the janitor had attacked him, that she had been unstable, that he had tried to stop her, to calm her, but she wouldn't listen. He said she slipped. The police wrote it down. Cameras flashed. Reporters would later repeat his version, word for word. They didn't check the mansion cameras that night. They didn't need to, at least not according to him. He told them the cameras were off during the storm. The lightning had damaged the system. The guards nodded. Everyone nodded. It was easier that way. Maria's body was taken away before sunrise. The rain had stopped by then, leaving only the smell of wet earth and metal in the air. The bikers stood by the road, helmets off, heads low. None of them said anything. They watched as Blake Wallace shook hands with the police captain, his face full of sorrow for the cameras. He even placed a hand on his heart when the reporters asked if he felt remorse. He said she had been part of his staff for years, that she was like family, that he would pay for her funeral, and then he went back inside. The town read the news the next day. Local millionaire attacked by employee, tragic death under investigation. The story spread, shaped neatly into the version Blake wanted the world to hear. But truth has a way of living in places people forget to look. In a small apartment on the edge of town, a little girl sat by an old laptop. Her hair was still wet from the night before, her knees still bandaged. She hadn't spoken since she was taken from the bridge, but her hands moved fast on the keyboard. She knew things no one else did. She knew her mother's passwords. She knew how to connect to the mansion's Wi-Fi. Her mother had shown her once, when she wanted to download homework while waiting during long shifts. Maria had laughed then, telling her to always remember the numbers because knowledge is power. Now those numbers were the only power left. Lila opened the connection, heart pounding. The Wi-Fi signal was weak, but still alive. The storm hadn't killed it after all. Through trembling fingers, she found the file. The camera footage wasn't stored on the cloud or in the police system. Blake had kept it local, connected to his own router, one that was still on. Lila clicked the file names one by one. Most were empty, static. Then one opened. The image flickered. Her mother was there, alive, moving, cleaning, working. Then came the moment when Blake entered. The shouting, the glass falling, the struggle, the fall. It was all there. Every second of it. Lila couldn't look away. The tears came silently this time. When the video ended, she sat still for a long moment, her small fingers gripping the mouse. Then she moved again. She selected the video, attached it to an email, and sent it to every contact she could find. Reporters, police, social pages, news channels. She didn't understand the full power of what she was doing. She only knew one thing. The truth couldn't die quietly. The footage leaked within hours. By noon, it was everywhere. On phones, on news feeds, on television. The video showed everything Blake had tried to hide. His voice, his violence, his face in the flash of lightning. People watched in silence. Then the silence turned to anger. The police had no choice but to reopen the case. Reporters camped outside his mansion. Sponsors pulled their deals. Politicians who once praised him began to distance themselves. Blake Wallace's empire started to crumble, not from the courts, but from the screens of ordinary people who finally saw what he truly was. Inside the mansion, Blake watched the footage play on his own television. His reflection stared back at him, blood on his hands, rage in his eyes. The sound of his own voice filled the room, the sound he thought no one would ever hear. He threw the remote at the screen, shattering it into shards. Outside, the world watched too. The bikers saw it on their phones while standing in the same spot under the bridge. The little girl's face appeared in the background of one clip sitting beside the laptop, rain still dripping from her hair. People called her brave. They called her the voice of the voiceless. For the first time in her life, Lila wasn't invisible. Her mother's truth had found its way into the light. The police returned to the mansion the next day, but the cameras were gone, the hard drives destroyed. It didn't matter anymore. The world had already seen enough. Blake Wallace was no longer untouchable. His money couldn't erase what millions had watched with their own eyes. In the days that followed, protests filled the city streets. Posters of Maria's face appeared on walls and windows. People spoke her name like a wound they wanted to heal. Lila stayed quiet through it all. She sat by the window, watching the rain return. The sky looked softer now, as if the storm had finally rested. She still missed her mother's voice, her laugh, the way she smelled of soap and lemon polish. But she also felt something else, something she had never felt before. Justice. It wasn't perfect. It couldn't bring her mother back, but it was real, and it had come from her hands. The truth that Blake tried to bury had grown too large to hide. It began with a spilled drink. It ended with a broken empire. And between those two moments lived the courage of one child and the memory of one mother who taught her that silence should never win. The truth came out because one child refused to be silent. You just watched her courage change everything. Don't be another silent viewer. Subscribe, share, and stand where the brave ones stand. Morning came slowly over Brook Hollow. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low, heavy and gray. The world looked washed out, as if even the sky was tired from what it had seen. By noon, the footage of Blake Wallace filled every screen in America. News anchors spoke his name with the same tone they once used for heroes, now dipped in disbelief. The man who had been praised for his success, his charities, and his shining image was no longer a symbol of power. He was a symbol of something else. Cruelty caught on camera. The video played again and again. The moment of the shove, the fall, the stillness that followed. Each time it aired, more people watched, more voices rose. The story spread faster than anyone could control. Outside the Wallace mansion, the first crowd gathered before evening. They came with signs, candles, and cell phones. Some shouted, some cried, some just stood in silence, rain dripping from umbrellas as they looked up at the marble walls where everything had happened. The gates that had once kept the world out were now covered in flowers, notes, and photographs of Maria. In one of those pictures, she was smiling, tired but kind, her hair tied back, her uniform neat. Someone had written beneath it in red marker, "Her silence spoke louder than his power." Reporters filled the streets, cameras flashing. They filmed the mansion from every angle. Police cars lined the driveway, lights spinning red and blue against the pale stone. Inside, Blake Wallace sat in his office, the same one where the fight began. The whiskey glass was still on the table, untouched. His face looked older now. The calm that once made him powerful had turned into something hollow. He stared at the phone on his desk, watching messages appear one after another. Investors leaving, sponsors pulling out, partners cutting ties. Every piece of his empire was falling apart, one call at a time. He tried to reach his lawyer, but even his lawyer stopped answering. By the second day, the police returned with new orders. The world had seen enough. The evidence was undeniable. The story he told about self-defense had burned away under the light of truth. When they came for him, Blake didn't resist. He didn't shout. He didn't even look surprised. Maybe he knew it was coming. Maybe he had always known that power built on fear never lasts forever. The camera flashes followed him down the mansion steps. His white shirt was clean again, but the memory of blood never leaves marble. Reporters shouted questions he didn't answer. The world watched a man who once commanded everything walk silently between two police officers. Across the city, people stopped what they were doing to watch the news. In diners, in schools, in bus stations, screens flickered with his face being led away in handcuffs. America watched a billionaire's mask crumble in real time. In the quiet apartment at the edge of town, Lila watched too. She sat on the floor beside the small coffee table, her knees drawn to her chest. The television glowed in front of her, showing the same scene over and over. The mansion, the crowds, the arrest. The noise filled the room, but she didn't move. In her hands, she held a photograph. Old, slightly bent, the edges soft from years of touching. It was her and her mother, standing outside a bus stop, both smiling at something off camera. Maria's arm was around her eyes full of warmth and life. The picture shook slightly in Lila's hands. She pressed it to her chest. Maria didn't survive that night. The truth had come too late to save her, but not too late to matter, because her daughter, small, scared, barefoot in the rain, had made sure the world heard her scream. Lila didn't think of herself as brave. She didn't even think about what she had done. She only thought about her mother, how she laughed softly when she was tired, how she always smelled of lemon polish and soap, how she promised that one day they'd live somewhere bright where no one would look down on them. Now that dream was hers to keep alive. As the sun began to set, orange light filled the small room. It touched the edges of the photo in her hands, turning her mother's face golden for a moment. Lila looked at it and smiled through her tears. The television still played in the background. Reporters talked about court hearings, investigations, protests. They said Maria's name again and again. Each time they said it, Lila whispered it too, under her breath, like a prayer. Maria's story had become everyone's story now, a reminder of the things people try to hide behind walls and money. In the weeks that followed, the city changed. People who had once worked for Blake Wallace came forward. Maids, drivers, security guards. All spoke about the things they had seen, the things they were afraid to say. Their stories matched. The court hearings dragged on for months, but the verdict was never truly in doubt. The evidence was everywhere. The footage had been saved by millions, shared across the world, preserved forever. Blake Wallace was found guilty. When the news broke, the same crowd gathered again outside the courthouse. They didn't cheer. They stood quietly, holding candles in the dusk. A small table held a framed photo of Maria. Beside it, someone placed a simple note written on lined paper. She worked so her daughter could live. She died so her truth could live longer. Lila was there too, standing beside one of the bikers who had helped her that night. His hand rested gently on her shoulder, not saying anything. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Some people spoke softly around her, telling stories they had read online, about Maria's kindness, about the janitor who stayed late to help others, about the woman who never complained even when she was tired. Layla listened, her eyes on the photo. For the first time, the world saw her mother the way Lila always had. Not as a worker, not as a victim, but as a person. The news cycle eventually moved on, as it always does. New stories replaced the old. The cameras left. The crowd thinned. But Maria's story stayed. People remembered it whenever they passed a cleaner in a hallway, whenever they saw a woman walking home alone after a long night shift. It lingered quietly, reminding everyone of what silence costs. Years later, there would still be videos, documentaries, songs, and essays about the janitor who exposed the empire. Her name would be spoken in classrooms, in campaigns, in whispers of courage. But for Lila, it was simpler than that. It was about love. Every night before bed, she would open a small box beside her pillow. Inside were three things: the photograph, her mother's old work badge, and a folded napkin with a faded coffee stain, the same one Maria had used during their late-night sandwich breaks. Lila kept them like treasures. They weren't worth money, but they were worth everything that mattered. She grew up slowly, carefully in a world that finally saw her. The bikers visited sometimes, bringing food, fixing the old door, or just sitting in silence with her. They never talked about that night. They didn't have to. It was written on all their faces. The mansion on the hill was sold, then abandoned, then turned into something else entirely. A shelter for women and children who needed a safe place to go. The city voted to rename it Maria's House. Every year on the same date, people gathered there. Some brought flowers, some brought stories, some just came to listen. Lila went too, always with her hair tied back the way her mother used to wear hers. She didn't like speeches, but when asked, she always said the same simple words. My mom didn't have a voice, so I used mine. When she said that, people always clapped softly, but she didn't do it for that. She did it because it was true. The world had once turned its eyes away from people like her mother, quiet, invisible workers who built lives for others but never got seen. Now, at least for a moment, people saw. As the crowd left each year, the sun would sink behind the old marble walls, painting them gold and red. Lila would stay a little longer, watching the light fade, listening to the evening breeze moving through the trees. It sounded almost like her mother's laughter. And sometimes, in the calm after everyone had gone, she would whisper into the wind, not in sadness but in peace. "I heard you, Mom, and they did too." Then she would walk home, slow and quiet, her heart steady. Because even though the world had changed, one truth never would. Love doesn't vanish when a person is gone. It echoes, it builds, it grows into something no one can silence again. Night returned to Brook Hollow, softer than before. The storms had passed, leaving the streets washed and still. The lights from the city glowed faintly through the mist, like the last embers of a long fire. In the hills, the mansion that once ruled the skyline stood quiet. The gates hung open now. The marble no longer gleamed. Rain had left streaks down its walls as if the sky itself had cried for what happened there. Inside, the rooms were empty. The floors that once echoed with commands and footsteps now carried only silence. Dust began to settle over the gold frames and crystal lights. Time had taken the house for itself, but the memory of what happened there never faded. It lived in the hearts of those who had seen, those who had heard, those who had chosen to act. The bikers who rode that night never called themselves heroes. They went back to their work, their families, their quiet corners of life. Yet sometimes when they heard thunder in the distance, they remembered the road, the rain, and the little girl who ran barefoot through the storm. And they smiled, not from pride, but from peace, because for once fear didn't win. Down in the city, candles still burned in windows. Some were for Maria, some were for others like her. Women who worked through the night, unseen and unheard, their lives woven into the world without applause or reward. Her name had become a whisper of strength. It lived on posters, in classrooms, in songs. People spoke of her as a reminder that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it cleans and cries and hopes, and still stands up in the end. And Lila, the little girl who carried that truth through the rain, grew into a woman who never forgot. She kept her mother's photo beside her bed, the same one she'd held while the world watched Blake Wallace fall. Some nights, when the wind blew softly through the curtains, she would touch the frame and feel calm instead of pain, because the world had changed. Maria's story had not just broken a man's power, it had opened a door. People began to speak more, to look closer, to ask questions when they saw something wrong. Silence was no longer a safe place for cruelty to hide. And though Lila never sought attention, the truth followed her. Schools invited her to talk, writers asked to tell her story, strangers sent letters saying thank you. But she always answered the same way, with quiet eyes and steady words. She was just my mom. She was just doing her job. In that simple sentence lived everything: love, loss, and the courage that can come from both. As years passed, the world moved forward. The rain came and went, the seasons turned, the city grew taller. But the story stayed. It became part of something bigger, a reminder that every act of kindness, every small truth spoken, could ripple far beyond the moment it was born. Because some heroes don't wear armor, some don't stand on stages, some don't even live to see the change they start. Some heroes wear leather, some wear cleaning gloves, but the bravest ones run barefoot into the dark, carrying the truth in their hands. And in the silence after the storm, when all the noise has faded, their footsteps are still heard. Justice never asked for money, it asked for courage. And courage, real courage, had finally answered.